Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well. Got a confirmation today. I've just come back from being quite unwell. I actually thought I had COVID and had to self-isolate for a week, but I got tested and it come back negative luckily. So I think I just had a bad flu, but to be honest I wish it was COVID because at least I'd get antibodies. But that's okay though. And I've just got a message before the video starts. Imagine that starting right now your life is a movie, and just how jacked up and unfair it is and how much of a mess it may be. And now, you have to be the hero of that movie. You have to turn all of this stuff around. Visualize yourself where you want to be and set goals and go out there and do it. It's up to you to change things, and the most important step that you're going to take forward is your next one. Remember, this is going to be a daily battle, and no matter what you go through in life, you're always there with one thing, and that's your mind. And that's something that never changes. Whether you're depressed and at the bottom of the ocean like I lived for such a long time, if you're anxious or whatever you're going through, remember your mind's always there with you, and you have to have power over it and not let your mind go into them dark places and pockets. The moment I started changing that and getting in control of my own mind, I got in control of my life. And you have to remember, accept everything totally for what it is. Remember, nothing's necessarily good or bad. Everything is what it is. And you really want to focus on enjoying your time while you're working on your goals. If your camera's always focused into the future, then you're never going to get there, because you're always living for somewhere that you're not. You have to learn to accept everything for what it is, be the hero of your own story, and start focusing the lens also on your surroundings and enjoy the process. If you do these things, your life will change forever and you'll be stronger than you ever realized you could become. I love you and enjoy these stories. And make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. Hello everyone, hope you're all doing great. I really hope you enjoyed these Skinwalker stories. I really enjoyed doing them and I know everybody loves them. And yes, I am fully aware that it's pronounced Navajo, not Navajo. It's literally because I've spent my entire life in London pretty much, or Stratford or whatever. And we do not get Skinwalkers or Navajo here, so it's new to me. But I'm aware now. And to be honest, I don't say it now, but I prefer Navajo because Anna Yusuf, so it's got my name in it, so it sounds cool. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed these. Oh yeah, the funny thing, it didn't even come up, so I've revised it. Not one story I found had Navajo in it, but now you know, and for future reference. So enjoy these stories, and we almost at 100k. I'm so excited. Enjoy it. Tonight was one of the scariest things that I've ever witnessed, and I don't know how to explain it. It's my second incident with the same thing, but this one was far scarier than the first. So the first incident I didn't think much about because this last April Fool's Day when my husband and I were driving home from a friend's ranch. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of white as our lights illuminated something by the side of the road in an adjoining field. It looks to be a stark white naked man, but he was running with his hands down like he's an animal and going very fast and parallel to our car in the opposite direction. We both freaked out as hell, but think it's probably an April Fool's joke. We're in the dead center of rural Montana. People get bored and do stupid things. Halloween gets crazy here, so we think it's a prank. Then tonight happened. I went down the road to where the mailboxes from our street are. It's that rural road delivery setup where you have about 20 mailboxes at the end of the long country road. It's about 200 yards from our house and the moon's out, so I figure I'll walk over to check the mail to go and see if my husband's picked it up. When I get there, I find a neighbour not too far from our door heading out the same way on a walk. So we start talking and she accompanies me to the mailboxes. I take a peek into the box. Nothing. We continue chatting for a few minutes when there's suddenly barking from several of the neighborhood dogs across from us. One at a time, they begin furiously snarling and barking, a few even howling. My neighbor mentions that there must be coyotes roaming again. Happens all the time. Nothing to worry about. Then suddenly, one of the dogs begins howling in pain. We both look at each other, thinking the same. Time to get the hell out of there. We start walking a bit briskly when she turns to glance over her shoulder for a second time and stops. I turned around and see it as well. It looks like a rather skinny-ish but stone white man, not on his feet but on all fours like an animal, no hair that I can see. The light from my phone got in his eyes for a second more, and it shines back like a cat. There was blood down the front of his jaws, and it all happens in maybe 2 or 3 seconds, so very quick. He then literally bolts after us as we run. My neighbour doesn't chain or fence in her dogs as we're animal lovers, and she likes having the extra protection of them wandering as well. So she starts yelling the dog's name, and he comes running out from his spot between our houses. He must have smelled this thing or heard it coming because he made an immediate beeline past us, growling like crazy. We reached my husband's working shed, so we hid in there and locked the doors and wait for the cops. All we can do is hide and wait in the shed while she told the cops to come out, hearing the dog barking and attacking whatever that thing was. After a couple of minutes, she's off the phone and we're hiding behind boxes of stuff away from the window. I don't know how long we're there, but before she whispered that the dog isn't barking anymore, and suddenly they're not making any sounds. After a few moments we heard crunching outside. Something starts scratching slow and hard against the front door and part of the wall next to it. I'm not too proud to admit that I weighed myself a little bit, and I throw my hands over my mouth to stop screaming. She was staring at the door, not moving, so I know I wasn't overreacting or anything. It seemed like forever, but eventually we saw the lights from the cops coming up the long road and the scratching stops. Whatever it was ran off because we heard the noise of leaves crunching hard and fast away from the door. She was brave and gets the guts to peek out the window, and the cops are close now. When they got near us, we ran to the cop cars and told them we saw a kind of man who chased us. She pointed out the direction that he had gone in and ran back, mentioning that the sounds of the dogs are in the opposite neighborhood and away from the mailbox. She said her dog come without us even calling, and we hid in the sheds. The cop takes our statements and said that somebody else had called a few minutes before, and that there was a wolf or something in her backyard that just killed the chickens, and their dog and the neighbour down had actually saw the thing too. The other cops found my neighbour's dog lying on the ground with what appears to be deep claw marks, having trouble breathing. As he's lying there, he gets bundled up, and the vet comes to pick him up, and he mentions how it looks like a bear's attacked. So I'll give a description of both of what the neighbour down from the owner of the dead dog described and what we saw. The neighbour said it looked like a stark white naked man, tall, wearing the skin of a bear or bison, brown furred and head attached, blood coming from the mouth and around the chest, very long arms. She caught him crouching over the dog, turns on the back porch light, and he ran off. What we saw was a pale man without hair, with long arms, eyes that glows like a cat, very quick, reddish glow, animal looking. When he started running after us, it wasn't awkward like a guy trying to run on his hands and feet. It looked like a person now, but it wasn't. This isn't the first time this kind of thing happened. It's not the first time I've heard of odd things. Montana's one of them places where so many weird and unexplainable things happen. But it's not the first time something odd's come after me in the dark. It's been a couple of hours and I'm still shaking. If that was me, I'd make the skinwalker bleed if it touched my dog. I would literally fight to the death over my dog. Skinwalker would be running from me. So for my backstory, my boyfriend and I had just bought our first house in June on a lake about half an hour northeast of Seattle, WA. Aside from the lake community we're part of, there really isn't a large range of population around here. We're in between a few larger towns, but they're all about a 20-minute drive from where we live. Our house is backed right up against a cascade of mountains. We're pretty much the last bit of population before the mountains begin. About 30 yards from our driveway is a dead-end road that turns off the main lake road and goes back into the woods for a few miles. There's a few gated Forest Service / logging roads that branch off from this. Boyfriend and I ride our dirt bikes up these roads, and they themselves go on for miles, but there really aren't any other houses in the area except for a few that are all on the main road. Before taking the dirt bikes up to it, I love dirt bikes, I had been walking up this road a few times exploring the area, and it always felt a little odd to me. My boyfriend said things like, "This is creepy even in daylight." It totally could have been that it was just very wooded in most spots and therefore shaded. The lack of houses made it odd, but I stopped walking up this road for this reason. When we moved in, I was dog sitting my friend's pit bull Bella. She's about 70 pounds and was a totally fearless brat. Now she's kind of aggressive with other dogs, and even with some people. I would walk her up to the end of the road, and I'd always feel okay because there were no cars or houses around. So one day we were about 2 miles up the main road and had come down a small hill onto a flat, treeless area where there was no old abandoned barn and a large field that cut through the road. There was tall grass on either sides of the road. When we got to the area, Bella's tail went down and she kept her head really low. She also started to look around and back behind us, acting nervous, which is really odd for her. As we're coming around a turn, about 100 yards in front of us is a logging road that went off the road straight up a hill. It had a large gate just at the bottom of it to keep vehicles out. My boyfriend and I have to put our dirt bikes under this gate before riding up the trails, so it's pretty tall. The top of the bar of the gate comes to my chest and I'm 5'5". What I saw still scares me to think about. Standing right in front of the gate is a huge black dog. It was standing broadside with its head low. I'm almost positive it's looking towards us, because I can't make out a snout or ears. I can't see a tail either, but it may have been lowered behind its legs. The shoulder of the thing was higher than the top of the gate. It was blocking part of the view. I stopped instantly and held Bella's harness so she couldn't advance forward and catch sight of it, and this dog's aggressive. I look at this thing for probably 2 seconds before running back and getting back to the main road because I heard this thing growl. I'm not kidding you. 100 yards away from it, I hear this thing, almost hissing. I'm totally terrified. So's Bella now, which is worrying. She's not even seen it. It was a long 2 miles back and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, and Bella's also freaking out the whole time. The growling, massive black dog wasn't the only thing I'm terrified of. I have this also feeling of dread that I can't get away from. Now I saw it, and it was overwhelming, and I've never felt fear like it before. Even while typing this, I'm shaking. I don't even feel safe when I'm home alone anymore. My boyfriend's 100% sure I saw a 6-foot black bear, but I'm certain it wasn't, as I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and have never seen black bears. Now this thing had long skinny legs and a deep curved rib cage. It's similar to a Doberman. Now, wolves don't live in this area. Even if they did, this would have been an abnormally large skinny wolf. I'm pretty sure what I come across is actually a skinwalker. After a stressful day at work, I gone over to my friend's apartment to shoot the breeze, eat some food and play a few games on my friend's PlayStation 4. It was getting late and I had to be up fairly early the next day. My friend walked out to the parking lot with me. Now there's no one else in the parking lot, just us two. As I'm unlocking my car, a dog walked out from the side of a nearby building about 25 feet away. It came fully into view and stops to look at us. It was a little bit bigger than a standard Great Dane. It's an all-black dog with long hair that appeared to be falling out in clumps. It has long ears and a scraggly tail. I remember making eye contact with it. It had dark maroon coloured eyes, and in the moment we locked eyes, it appears almost to smile at us. Instead of a dog's lips going up and back, they go slightly sideways, and I see white teeth like a human almost. I recall suddenly getting a feeling of dread and fear. It felt like something disguised as a dog pretending to be one, but it's not. I'm certain of it. The energy coming off this thing doesn't feel right either. I really don't know how to describe it. It turned around and starts slowly limping back to the corner it's come from. My hair goes up. It turned around and slowly starts staring at us before heading off. It seemed to have most of its weight on its front feet, walking like a hunchback. The way it was limping, I noticed its rear left foot is wrapped up in a blue gauze, and the foot appears very odd. The heel was parallel to the ground actually. I'm unsure if my friend saw exactly what I saw, but she suddenly said, "It's leaving, let's follow it," and she ran after the damn thing. And it disappeared right around the corner. I remembered being scared for my friend, so I sprint after her. Around the corner with my friend, looking around confused. The dog? It's gone. At the rate it was walking and limping, it couldn't have got anywhere. The air was suddenly cold, even for South Texas in January. My teeth were chattering. My friend told me to go quickly back to her apartment, lock the door and stay inside. I warned her that this isn't a dog. I texted her when I'd gone home. Once at the safety of home, I text my friend and say that I hope this is the end of it, but even as I'm sitting there in bed, my heart is racing. It doesn't help that around 12 AM, there was low whistling right outside my window. My neighbour's house isn't too far from mine, but they're good people and there's no logical reason for them to be that close to my window at night whistling. I didn't make any indication that I was aware of the whistling. It's not even musical, just like somebody trying to get their attention. Eventually, the whistling stops and I hear nothing else. I have a lot of trouble sleeping. I've never seen or experienced anything like this. To the best of my knowledge, it could be a skinwalker. I'm going to try my best to describe this in a cohesive manner. It's been a few years and a lot of stuff happened this night, but it's forever in my memory and haunting. If anyone has an idea what it is, I'd love to hear it. So in July of 2014, I'd been dating my now ex-boyfriend for a couple of months and decided to move in with him. I'm going to change names just for the sake of this. We'll call him Tom. So Tom lives on the Catagaras Indian Reservation in western New York. He's 100% Senkar, and his family has properties on reservation land. I'm only 25% Senkar, and because my mum is white, I'm not an enrolled member. So I never grew up going to Longhouse or living on the res because the majority of families are white Catholics. He lives on a side of the major road going through the res called Route 438. One night, we get in a big argument and I'm annoyed and go away for a bit. Living with him full time doesn't offer me a break, so I'm pretty annoyed. What's worse is I don't have a car at the time, so I decide at 2 AM that I'm gonna walk. Anger clouds my judgment, and I had to leave. He kept saying to me to stay and blocks the door, and picked me up and brought me back. He's adamant, but so am I. He was concerned I'd go into weirdos cruising around. I was so angry that I didn't care. and I also grown up walking the woods at night, so never really had an issue. So I walk out the door and up the driveway and start heading down this road. It's pitch black with brush on both sides, but there's a few trailers his aunts and uncles owned. As I get closer to the stop sign where his road ends and connects to Route 438, I see a light heading towards me. I get freaked out and realise it's a person heading towards me. Now, it's not really uncommon for people to be walking by the res at night, but as we got closer, I debate turning back. But I was mad and kept going. Suddenly the person says, "My name?" Then, "What the hell?" I recognise the voice as Tom's cousin that lives in the trailer behind us. I was so relieved that it was him and not a stranger. We stopped to talk and he told me that he's walking home from a party. I told him me and Tom fought and I was heading into town to stay with friends. He told me I was crazy and it's not safe for girls to walk around at night, and said I could stay at his father's trailer for the night. Sounds more logical than walking 9 miles alone. When he headed back towards the end of the road, we get to the trailers and pass a clearing in the brush where the old driveway was. I look into the clearing and I can't really explain what I saw. It was so dark, but I could see whatever this was. It's much darker than the environment around it. It was completely black, to the shape of a skinny but massive human-like shape. It was crouched so its knees are in front of its stomach, but its arms are so long. I was shaking right in this, and I can't explain what it appeared to be. I saw it quickly, and then looked straight ahead. 3 seconds later, Tom's cousin says, "Did you see that?" And I said yeah, and we instantly start sprinting as fast as possible. He was faster and started yelling, "Just go." We got into his trailer and sat in silence. I think maybe we both saw it and didn't know for sure until we saw each other. The walk felt like it took an eternity. I felt this horrible feeling of being watched. Its arms were massive. They're so long that even crouched or seated, with its knees bent, it's able to keep its back upright and not back like it's supposed to do. It's at least 7 feet tall. I have no idea what it could have been, and I have no experience of anything like it. And my ex would never talk about it, saying I was just seeing things, but his cousin saw it too. A few months ago, my roommates and I are out taking a drive trying to find a fun place to visit. I'll call them S and J for privacy's sake. S was driving and told us about a playground in Skelly that she used to go with a friend, so we decided to check it out. The playground wasn't very special, but it was interesting because it was half old playground equipment that you could tell someone hadn't used in years, and half new equipment. While we're enjoying time over there, I start hearing whispering from the near side of the playground, which didn't freak me out because I've heard them since I was a child. But I called out to Jay and she and I walked over there. By the time S joined us, the whispers had stopped and we're about to head to the car when, out of nowhere, a truck comes speeding down, seemingly from just where we stepped across from earlier. Naturally, when it stopped, we all freeze. We're in the shadows of the trees trying desperately not to be seen because it's near dawn and we don't want to be caught by some random local in the park, especially not within closing hours and get in trouble. But before we knew what was happening, the driver gets out of his truck and stood facing the crossroad that led out, and we suddenly hear a howl sound. It was deep and almost inhuman. It starts out low in pitch, then gets higher. It's a really creepy sound. It goes silent for a few seconds, then starts again for another 5 or 6. What really caught our attention is that we're out in a small country town at night, so there's a lot of birds and insects, but when the driver started howling, everything went dead silent. I mean, everything. After it started its third howl, we ran to the car and sped off. We didn't know what we witnessed and we definitely felt that something was horribly wrong. S and I drove about 45 minutes home and dropped off Jay at home, only to decide that we want to go back now that the sun's up. But when we arrived back in Cthulhu, we're in for a surprise. First off, there is not a crossroad anywhere close to the playground. There was only a curve in the road, but we distinctly remembered seeing a four-way crossroad under the streetlights. Also, there wasn't a football field that we saw earlier. I know things look different in the dark, but they shouldn't be that different, and all of us remember the same thing. We have no idea what we witnessed that day. It's really crazy, and it seemed almost evil and malevolent. So I had a weird encounter a few months ago, and I feel like maybe this would be a good place to post it. I was sitting in my living room watching TV around 8:30, and it was pretty dark outside. All of a sudden, I heard knocks on my door, so I get up to see who's there. No one I know ever knocks on the door, they just walk in. So anyway, I'm standing on my porch with three guys. Just one look at them and I'm scared. They seem almost like caricatures of humans, but ones that walk straight out of hell and onto my doorstep. They were dressed up like Mormon boys in suits, but their name tags only said Jesus Christ. They never introduced themselves and kept asking for people by name. Honestly, I can't convey how uncomfortable it made me feel. I barely remember their faces, but the one in the middle was just smiling the entire time. I don't know how, but my instincts told me that these aren't normal people, and I should never have opened the door. Now, I get out of the conversation by saying I'm cold and don't really have a good time talking. Now I slammed the door and I never saw or heard from them again. It's been a few months now, and I still have no idea who they were to this day. I always loved the chance to get out into national forests and parks. I really like jogging. I find a true tranquility when I'm going through them with nothing but the cool summer's air with me. I would do it in winters too, but it was a lot worse because obviously the leaves were very slippery and you wouldn't always see people about outside of the occasional park ranger. But this story took place on one summer's evening. I was feeling really good. I made a playlist and was listening to some podcasts while I was jogging. I set out at about 9 PM, so it was still kind of light outside. As I was jogging, I couldn't help become more and more aware of how dark it seemed to be getting, quick, and I mean almost too quick. I'd go on my phone for literally less than 5 minutes, and when I looked up, it got noticeably darker. Not just in the sense of my eyes adjusting. I mean, it was a weird feeling. And I feel like somebody's watching me. I decide just to try and walk back because I'm getting really tired now, which is another strange thing. I've come to realize it might have been my body's response to fear, but I felt drained and really tired in a way that I've never felt it before. I decide to press on regardless. Cycle through my songs and feel good again. Now as I'm walking, I realise that there's a mist that's setting over the park. Now this is something that I've never experienced before. Well, I have, just not in the summertime, so it's something that I found very strange. I start to hear interference with my headphones too, and think it might be because of the moisture from the fog and take them off. That's when I realise that I can hear a hissing sound. It's not a normal sound that you would hear from electric interference, it's almost like an animal making it, but I've never heard it before, and my heart drops. The feeling of being watched overpowers me now. I feel darkness like I've never felt before, like true evil's around. I think maybe there's a park ranger there with his radio messing up. I call out, but I don't hear anyone. I suddenly think it is a bad idea to call out, and I begin jogging. As I start jogging, I hear a crash behind me. I turn to look, and there's a very tall, dark figure just off beside a tree. Now what terrifies me is that there's a tree that's been knocked over that was standing before. I know for a fact that it's either a 1 in a billion chance it fell then and none of the other trees did, or something menacing's following me. Now this thing has to be at least 6'2" and has long arms. It sounds like it's describing exactly me so far. I can't see any eyes, but I can tell that this thing's facing directly towards me. I wipe my eyes, and it doesn't move. I say, hey, if this is a ranger, you need to stop because I'm scared now. And I'm met with silence. It slowly moves behind the tree. I've seen enough now. I can't deal with this. I go into a fight or flight state and I'm literally frozen for a second. I tell myself, no, I'm not going out like this, and I start sprinting as quick as I can. The whole time I'm running, I can hear this thing chasing just behind me. I get to the car park and there's no other cars there, so it's me alone now. Great. So if this thing attacks me, I'm screwed. I jump into my truck and drive as quick as I possibly can, getting out of the wooded area. Now the craziest thing is, this thing's still following me. I can hear things breaking behind me, like a very tall and very heavy thing's chasing me through the woods. I'm literally screaming and praying for God to help me out in this moment. I can just about see him in my mirrors, but it's very foggy at the time. I have to slam on the brakes at one point too because I nearly hit a tree because how dense the fog had become. I continue driving and eventually make it back onto the main road. I'm literally crying the entire time. I end up going to a ranger station and explaining what I saw, and they say I'm not the only one that's reported something similar. People have been reporting it as a bear, but it's not possible because there's no bears in this specific area. I have no idea what it was, and nor do the park rangers, but they say I wasn't the only one who had that reaction. And there was a strange smell that accompanied that thing. I didn't get that close to find out, but everyone described it exactly the same as me. They're already doing patrols trying to find that thing, but they never found it. It still shakes me to my core thinking about it to this day. So this didn't happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. My friend and I were discussing the scariest things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy was with 5 of his friends and was spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk but had a few beers to unwind one night, so one of them goes out to the outhouse to use the bathroom. He can hear some faint beating sounds in the distance like a low drum. So he finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come and check out the sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out the ridge of their cabin, down the holloway behind it and up the other side. It's a pretty rocky area, so the sound travels far. They could tell that it's just over the hill, so 5 of them spread out about 50 feet and walk up to the top. They can't see completely over there because there's large bushes around them. Now, they just sneak down and try and see what it is. One of them goes over there, and he stands there and watches for about 30 seconds to a minute, before telling his friends that they have to run as quick as they can, and saying what he saw was evil and they need to get out of there now. He said all he could see was a bunch of naked people dancing around a fire pit with some kind of pentagram on the floor. He never told them about everything he saw. He just said he was too scared ever to go back in the woods again or near that area. I was born and raised in Charlotte, NC, and still live on the east side. There's a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which was mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly placed amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realise it because of the stretches of infrastructure around it. There's a myth and folklore tale about a devil church or satanic ritual area deep within that park. There's a few videos of people trying to find it. Now in my senior year of high school, after searching around the internet, I heard about where this is supposed to be and decided I want to find it. So my girlfriend and I at the time decided to try and find it on the road that leads into the church. We end up driving down miles of winding roads behind a car max that borders the dense woods of the park where a small neighbourhood of sorts is. I think I gotten the two street names wrong, but they're very close to the spot. Now cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind that there's almost no streetlights anywhere. We're driving about another 2 or 3 minutes and there had been a pickup truck behind us for maybe 50 feet or so. Upon seeing the dirt track and everything else around, our interest had peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we want to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track simultaneously. The pickup truck ahead abruptly stops and stays in place. We notice this, having pulled finally into the dirt road at this point. We're immediately frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly puts their car into reverse and began to immediately back up towards us at max speed. I throw my car into reverse and panic in an attempt to back away from where we come from. I was able to get turned around and drive back into the woods fairly quickly. The driver's accelerating at us at full speed now and I have to floor it to try and get out of there. We literally never look back. We never ended up finding the church and have no idea who was following us in the woods that day. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this, but when I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighbourhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down a trail. This trail curves through the marsh into a big patch of woods, about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall or spring, after heavy rain, a fog would often settle over the marshes, as it was much lower than the surrounding area. It really looks like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he's probably about 13 and I was 16 at the time, decided it's a great idea to explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it into the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would get dark by the time we got home, and we head for the trail. Once we're in the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick the fog is. We'd only been walking for about a minute or two, but we have absolutely no visibility behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. So we continue walking for a few more minutes, now we come up to a curve in the trail. This curve signalled that we're only about 100 yards from the entrance of the woods. At this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail and some marshland further to the right. Now we began walking past the lake when we hear a splash. Definitely much bigger than a fish jumping, almost like a person done it. It's a really strange sound. Now we couldn't have been up there for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could only have been about 10 feet, a figure steps out from the brush bordering the fog. Now, it's so thick that we can't make out details, but he must have been about 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As this figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and stopped. Its head shot over and looks right at us. It felt like it must have been an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true terror in that moment that I've never felt before. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took over into the marshland running again. There were no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that we ran. We kept on sprinting until we got back home, and we never went back to that area again. I grew up in the Midwest US. When I was a senior in high school, I was out for a hike at a local trail in the National Forest. This is a good 20 miles from town, way out in the sticks. It's a box canyon, so you start at the rim and hike down into the canyon. It was autumn and late afternoon when I pulled into the empty parking area, but there's plenty of light around. But by the time I got to the bottom, the sun's pretty low. I was down in the canyon and get the feeling that something isn't quite right. I start looking behind me as I walk every few steps. I can't shake this feeling. Finally, on one of these backward glances, I spotted a man peeking out from behind a tree, not far at all, maybe 100 feet away. It was the weirdest thing to catch somebody watching me. He knew I'd seen him and stepped out saying, "I'm not looking to scare you." He's a big adult male, very old looking, and I'm a scrawny 16-year-old kid, and we're on a trail in the public park. There's no reason to hide like that. He seems alarmed that I've even seen him. The only reason he was out there is if he's weird. I mumble something about getting back to my car, and this horrifying grin comes across his face. He's just standing there staring at me. I'm running for a long time and I can still tell that he's watching me. And when I get back to the parking area, there's no cars other than mine, which added to the weirdness. I realised later that he must have been out there for some time because of the state of his clothes. It's interesting how when you get the sensation that you're being watched, it's normally true. I have no idea what his intentions were. I'm just really glad that I was aware of what was going on and he didn't spring up on me, because I don't know what he was capable of. I went to a summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we'd do as a group activity every day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out onto the water. The two square floating docks further apart. One of the two floating docks is further away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp, I'd never seen anybody use the second dock. One day on the group, a dozen 11-year-olds got to the bright idea that we're going to swim out to the faraway dock. I consider this to be a challenge. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange looking spider on the ladder that you had to climb up. I would have a heart attack. It was quite large in terms of overall footprint. Probably 3 inches from end to end. Nah, screw that. Spiders, of course, are normal critters in nature, but this one stood out as looking unusual. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. No way did they just go over that spider like that. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started really messing around and decided to play around for a bit. We're playing a regular game where we shuffle towards one corner of the dock, making it sink. Oh god. As the corner of the dock starts to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders come, frantically crawling out from between the boards, swarming over around the feet of those who are still standing on the dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all began to scream immediately and jump up trying to get away, but the spiders are in the water too. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair as I began hopelessly trying to get them off. Adrenaline kicks in and we swim to the other side that's spider free. But this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I had not really been afraid of spiders before, but this is a turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, unaware to how many of them were there, creeps me out to this day. That is literally hell on earth. This happened about 5 years ago now. I had gone through a rough breakup, and I was going through a phase where I wanted to be more independent, self-efficient, and generally more okay being alone. I would go to a lot of movies and restaurants by myself, etc. At the time, I'm living in Montana, where spending time outdoors is a prime recreation. Camping solo seems to be a very good exercise in truly being self-reliant, so I packed a little tent and went to the Jerry Johnson hot springs. Jerry Johnson is a natural hot spring with a few small, mostly natural pools of water in the mountains on the border of Montana and Idaho. I'm trying to keep this as brief as possible as I don't want to go into too much detail. What I will say is that it's truly in the middle of nowhere. From the interstate, it's about 1/3 of a mile hike across a bridge into the woods, and from the interstate, it's about a 45-minute drive in the either direction that you've come from before you find any kind of civilization, which is only in the form of a gas station. There isn't a motel or anything attached to the hot springs like you get in some places. It's literally nothing but forest land with a few tiny ponds of warm water, and if you ever go, you'll probably be the only one there. There's plenty of daylight, so I decide I'll go and soak first, and then set up my camp when I'm finished. I make the short hike to find that there's a couple, a man and a woman in their late 30s-ish, in the main pool, and they look very startled at the sight of me. I say a friendly hello from a distance as I approach. At first they don't even reply, just stare. Then the guy pipes up, "What are you doing, man?" I tell him I'm confused. He then says, "Is that you that's been creeping around the woods watching us for the last hour?" I assure them that I have no clue what they're talking about, and they begin telling me that there's someone in the woods way off the trail. Apparently, they've been yelling at him and he doesn't respond. He'll walk away into the woods for a while and reappear somewhere, just watching. After they've been assured that it isn't me, I get undressed and get into the water. Their pupils are huge, like they've ate some mushrooms. I've never asked, but it seems pretty obvious. It's not a big deal. It's basically the perfect setting for it, I guess, but it makes me wonder what they're doing. We talk for a while, first about the creepy guy and then other stuff when the mood lightens, and I'm relieved not to be alone now. I'm a relatively large guy, and I guess there's strength in numbers. No more sightings of the creeper. They get out before me. I'm in the pool by myself for about 10 minutes before I hear shouting in the woods. I decide to cut my soak short, just in case someone's in trouble. I get out, dry off quickly, and get dressed still moist, and I hear a shout. I start quickly hiking. I eventually come across a couple shouting off into the woods things like, "We've got a gun," which they don't. I ask what's going on, and they say the guy was just ominously standing in the path looking at them in the distance. When they started to shout, apparently he retreats into the woods, now out of sight. For all of this though, they never got a good look at him. We walk back to our cars, decide we'll camp near each other. There's an official campground, but you have to pay. The guy tells me he knows another spot which is relatively flat that would work. I agree and follow them. It's not very far. They set up their tent and I set up mine about 100 yards away. I want to give them plenty of space to trip or whatever else they're gonna do there. We're in a dry season, on raw forest floor, so neither of us made a campfire. I got all set up and just sat around reading a book and enjoying nature. The mosquitoes made me retreat into my tent at about 6 PM, and by 9 I'm asleep. At about midnight, I was awoken by the sound of screaming. I grab my flashlight and .22 pistol, put on some shoes but don't tire them, and start running towards the other tent. When I arrived, the two men were standing outside of the tent with their own flashlights completely losing it. They said they'd been there, and apparently the guy was there too. They showed me a slice in the wall of their tent that apparently he made with a knife. They haphazardly packed their stuff and hurried away, getting back to their cars. I only realised that I hadn't grabbed my own stuff. I say if they could go back with me and they said, "Sorry man, you're on your own." I thought about it for a minute. I could come back the next day and get my stuff, but it was over an hour drive in any direction. I did have a gun, but if someone shot at me, even in self-defense, that would be begging another kind of nightmare that would last the rest of my life. I decided I would go back for my stuff. I killed my flashlight and basically went stealth ninja mode back into the trees surrounding the clearing where my tent is. My thought was that if it was really quiet, then I could hear him, but he couldn't hear me. It took me about another 20 minutes to get to where my tent was. When I got back to my tent, it's untouched. I quickly threw on my backpack, put my flashlight in my mouth, grabbed my tent in its fully assembled state with my sleeping bag, still inside, and ran back to the car with a loaded .22 revolver in my hand, stabilizing the awkward tent. I get back to my car and drove away. Now, what didn't really occur to me until later is that I never actually saw that guy, and to this day, I can't even be sure if he was actually there in the woods. I kind of doubt that these people would have sliced their own tent, but at the same time, they were happily hanging out in the wilderness all day, miles away from others. It's possible that they were just messing with me, but if so, they deserve an Oscar, because they seemed absolutely terrified. I hate to think what would have happened if I hung around to find out the truth. I was in the woods with 3 friends at night. A friend's house was nearby, and I was getting hungry, so I went inside to find some food. Another friend came inside with me. 2 friends were still outside. Later on, one of the other 2 who were outside comes in and sees the indoor friend on the couch next to me. They panic and immediately run back outside. I poke my head out the door asking what's going on, and they yell loudly, "That's not Kevin." Everyone come inside and calms down a bit, and the story comes out. They thought the person indoors is with me, Kevin, and have been outside the entire time with them. Why? Because in the darkness of the woods they see a silhouette about the same height walking alongside them silently. Then at some point it ran away, and they were chasing it thinking it's Kevin. The reason my friend called out "That's not Kevin" was to stop the last outdoors friend from chasing whoever there was deeper into the woods. We still have no idea who it was to this day. I grew up in the Midwest about 10 years ago, and I moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. When I worked there, I worked for a company that runs cable rentals and a water taxi service, transporting campers and hunters, and sometimes freight to various locations, sometimes just 20 minutes away, others it was hours. Now during the winter, a few years ago, we had a couple staying in one of the very basic cabins, like the kind you get at summer camp. My understanding was the guy Dick was taking a class at the trade school in town, so he'd be gone all day, while the woman Jane stayed at the cabin with their 3 dogs. We never saw her outside while he was away. Now one day, Jane burst into the cabin in tears, being hysterical. She told us Dick had been beating her for days, starving her, that he'd been locking her in the cabin while he was away, that he even threatened her with his dogs. So we immediately called the police, and while we waited for them to arrive, she told us the details of their relationship. Jane's from South Africa and a wealthy family. Her father recently passed away and she got some inheritance. She'd met Dick on a social media site, and he sold her on some bogus dream of building on a remote lodge. He convinced her to transfer all of this money, and apparently he was spending it on property. Jane was totally at Dick's mercy. She voluntarily transferred the money to him. It was evident that she'd grown up wealthy. She didn't have an idea of how to care for herself. By the time the police arrived, She had reversed her story. She wouldn't tell them that he'd hit her, threatened her, or locked her in the cabin. I walked over to the other side of the cabin to talk to Dick with the officer, and of course, he denied everything. The cop was very frustrated. It was clear Dick was mistreating her, but he didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. I told Dick that he needed to leave the property anyway. I didn't want him there, and the woman didn't want to go with him. Jane managed to get in touch with a friend in the US who brought her a plane ticket, and another employee and I offered to drive her to the airport in the city, about 200 miles away. Now that very night, Dick left without any issues, and the last thing I said to him was that he can't come back, and if I ever saw his truck in the area again, I'm gonna call the police and assume the woman's in trouble with no hesitation. I really felt terrible for the woman. She basically made a bad investment and had little hope of recovering the money. Months had passed. It was well into the summer, and I'd forgotten about the incident. I had heard Jane had gone back to Dick, and they're out in town. This is from another taxi operator. He'd been transporting them to and from their remote property because Dick wrecked the boat he bought with Jane's money on a rocky beach. One day, I answered a phone call from a very distraught woman from the other side of the country. She was desperately trying to find her son, who answered, and Dick had posted online looking for help to construct his remote property. She'd just been calling water taxi operators to ask if they knew this guy Dick. Apparently, her son Mike had called from a satellite phone out of the property and told her he was in danger. They weren't getting along, and Dick finally ran him off the property. The property was out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by sea or air with no roads. You can't tell someone to leave because they don't know where to go. Mike's mother relayed to me that Dick wouldn't let him sleep in the cabin, that he wouldn't share food and would even chase him with a rifle when he realized Mick had a satellite phone. It was lucky he managed to call them out. Mike's mother called with the intention of hiring us to pick up her son. I said to her, "Miss, this is an emergency, you need to call the police." And I contacted the police and Coast Guard immediately, and they jointly dispatched a boat and helicopter to the area to rescue this guy. Mike is rescued safely, and Dick was arrested. Jane was there too, but refused to come back with the police and stayed at the cabin. Mike came out to the office a few days later. He gave me a big hug and says thank you. He was convinced I'd saved his life, which was a nice statement, but in my opinion, it's the police and Coast Guard that actually saved him. Now, he gave me some details of the experience, that Dick had actually taken several shots at him for a while chasing him through the woods. He told me when Dick caught up to him, he held him at gunpoint, made him naked and locked him in a shipping container that's on the property, convinced he was gonna die. He was still locked in the container when the police arrived. Mike never stayed for long, but I was impressed that he took the time to come out introducing himself, and I wished him luck. Dick is charged with attempted murder, but they were dropped. Mike ended up with a hefty settlement from the inheritance money that Dick swindled from Jane. I received a phone call later that summer from a property and a reporter in the city. These were asking about what happened. I agreed to tell him what I knew on the condition that he doesn't mention my name or that of the company I work for. The other night I was having a few beers with my old neighbour Al. A young guy had moved into town last year. The story popped into my head, and when I mentioned Dick's name, he perked up. They worked together at a shipyard. I can't believe it, this guy's back in town, without Jane this time working a minimum wage job. So in Canada, we have a scout system similar to the US. Our system by level is Beavers, Cubs, Scouts, and Venturers, so this happens during the Cubs. So, there was this house on the property of the camp. It's beautiful. It's a really nice wooden one. I really like it there. Now during this time, all the troops around us gathered for a camping weekend at the house. There was maybe 7 troops gathered. We'd be doing wooden car racing, etc. The house was split into 2 rooms, one for males and one for females, and there was a closet door that connected the rooms. At the time there's about 20 guys in one room and about 15 females. We'd be sleeping on the floor with our sleeping bags. After brushing, me and the guys went back to the guys' room. We're talking about things and one of the kids said that this place is haunted and that the closet that leads into the girls section is where somebody was hanged. Now I'm not gonna lie, I always felt strange in that doorway, so much so in fact that I specifically put my sleeping bag across the other side of the room. There was also an air vent there, and I'm afraid of it, so then I move in the middle of the night and try and get between the 2 things. Now on that night, after the counsellors shushed us to sleep, because you guys know we talk for hours on end if we can't sleep. It's around 4:30, I'm awoken, my head facing towards a closet. I notice that something is going down. The closet door is slowly opening. I was kinda stunned. Girls shouldn't be peeping on guys. Then when I saw the shadow, no bigger than 6 foot, it was crazy tall for its size. Now, best I can describe this from memory is like the colour Vanta black. It was very blurry but crisp until in the middle. It slowly inches its way across the wooden floorboards, no sounds even. It just silently passed each kid as it went by. I didn't want this thing to see me, so I turned my head. It passes more kids. Now I really don't want it to see me, so I'm really trying to lay low, but I'm trembling. I don't know what it wanted. It kept moving slowly, passing a few kids ahead of me, then it happened. The closer it got, the more I felt dread. Not only did I feel dread, but the air's getting colder physically. I felt the strangest sensation when it passes me too. I was maybe a feet from the door, so when it went to the other entrance I'm at, I'm not joking, it was literally turning the doorknob. It pulled the door open and slowly exited. Before, strangely enough, the door shuts itself. That morning, we're getting up from bed and walked down the rickety old steps. One of the kids said, "Did you guys see the shadow last night?" And maybe 4 kids' eyes widened. We all blurted yes. We talked about it for a short time, and let's just say, after that experience, everyone's sleeping bag was on the other side of the room. So this isn't related to hiking directly, but I was out in the country lands of Texas on this remote trail mountain bike that I like to ride when in town. While riding through, I saw an older man ahead of me walking very strangely. I remembered him looking up at the sky. I see him about 60 yards ahead. It's a single track, so I don't have room to go around him, so I simply stop and he hears me brake and turns to me with his head level staring at me. What happened to me next is what made my skin crawl. He starts talking and waving his arms around, but his voice sounds nothing like he looks. It's kind of like a child talking and screaming at the same time, but this guy's obviously in his 50s. He kept talking, but it's like somebody playing a recording from his body with animations not lining up to what he's saying. I turn around and book it back to where my car is and left quickly. Now he could have easily been a lunatic with a child's voice, but there's no other cars at the trail entrance and he's a good 5 miles in with no gear or clothes of that of a hiker. God, I hate remembering his voice in my head. It still haunts me. I used to love to go camping in national forests and parks. It truly was one of my favourite pastimes, and to be honest, it was something I didn't really do enough. Now, I was lucky enough to live very close to a national forest, and I did take advantage of this many times. I pretty much always go hiking with a few of my friends. We'd have a good time. We didn't necessarily have to do much, but just sitting there talking to each other always made it fun. There was one summer's evening that we all went out on, and we're having really good laughs on the drive there. One of my friend's cars broke down, but it shouldn't have been funny, but we just found it hilarious because it happened to the guy where things always go left to him. Now, as we're driving, we're joking about, imagine if something happens to us today and we haven't even got enough cars to get back, and we're all laughing about this. We eventually get to the park and put both of the cars to the side. We get all of our stuff out, turn on a radio and start walking. We've left too late and nightfall's already upon us. We probably should have set up our camp in one of the designated spots, but we weren't really thinking clear at the time. We're drinking a few beers along the way too. One of my buddies has a massive torch and he breaks that out. And I'm not joking with you, it's literally brighter than daylight, it feels like. It hurts my eyes even looking near it, but it gives us more than enough light for what we're doing. Eventually, of course, that runs out of battery, and we're basically guided by the moonlight. We eventually find a spot and all of us stop and set up our tents. As we're doing so, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. I keep thinking I see things in the shadows, but I'm sure my eyes are just playing tricks on me, so I continually tell myself that it's my mind playing tricks on me. Now there's a point where I have to get up to pee. My buddy Kevin's already went ahead of me. I can hear him making this stupid screeching sound in the forest. I just start really laughing to myself. When I'm walking I say, "Kevin, I thought your voice should have dropped by now." I continue walking to a spot that's out of the way of the others. Now as I'm doing so, I can hear Kevin trying to sneak up on me. He's just moving in and out of the tree line, just close enough that I can still see him. As I turn, I can't stop laughing because it's so obvious what he's doing and it's really not scaring me. I don't even bother talking to him and I continue walking. Now from here, I can see that Kevin's actually walking on a bit of a bank. He's 6'1" or 2" now when he's normally 5'8". His arms look kind of weirdly long and I think that he's put his hands inside of his shirt to make them look different. That's when it hits me. This isn't Kevin. In a heartbeat, I scream and start sprinting back towards the others. I can hear them go dead silent as they're confused as to what's actually going on. They think I'm playing a prank on them, and when I get to them they're all laughing. Then somebody speaks up and says, "Were you the one making them screamy sounds in the woods?" It's Kevin. He can tell by the look on my face that we need to get out of there, and without saying another thing, we pack up all of our things and get to the trucks as quick as we possibly can. We even drove the one that had the flat tire, but it doesn't matter now, we need to get out of there. As we're saying this, the whole time my buddy's explaining to me, I thought we were being followed, but I never said it. There was some tall thing following us in the tree line. I just thought I was being stupid. I frantically said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And he said, "I thought my mind was playing tricks on me." I'm really struggling to explain what I saw. Now I know for a fact that whatever was following me wasn't a normal person, or at least couldn't be made by a normal person because of the sounds it made. When I realised that it wasn't Kevin walking on the bank and this thing really was massive, it really shook me to my core. We went straight to the park ranger and he said that there was other people reporting that there was something over 6 feet moving through the forest at a jogging pace. It never seemed to let up. People described it as having fur covering its body and almost glowing eyes. They were the ones who saw this in the daylight. They sent out a patrol and couldn't find anything. All they reported was a strange odour that wouldn't seem to leave the forest. I never went camping like that again, and even if I hear animals scream, it always brings me back to that moment and realising that it was not Kevin. This happened in the summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time at my grandpa's cabin. He shares it with a few other hunters next to a very big lake. You need to take a boat to get to the cabin, I had gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements to the cabin. I looked on a printout of a satellite map, and I found the area that the cabin's in. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it's sort of in a valley, and it was very hard to get any sort of signal in. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one we're at, and there was a small island inside the lake. Me and my dad go to the boat and found a nice pristine little island. We don't actually go on it though. We can see that there's some swampy areas and a small fiberglass boat that hunters use to hunt ducks sometimes. The lake was much higher than the one we come from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat that we just come in to get up the hill. Me and my friend head back to explore the island. We headed up the hill and noticed there's a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river but was blocked up by a beaver dam. Me and my friend started to walk through it, and I started to feel uneasy because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver. It turns out my friend was feeling the same too, and we don't know why. He just felt that there was something weird about the lake. We left the gorge and made our way up to the top of the hill. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch the boat, we make it to the lake. Now I must say that I'm almost 6'4" and my friend's 5'7", so it's a challenge to get us in the boat, along with there only being one oar. We eventually made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. We both feel very uneasy, but I put my mind off and try and distract myself a bit. Now, I'm bored, and being in a small boat, see if we could tip over if one of us sneezed for a laugh. We're almost 2 hours away from a town or hospital though, so we're both kind of worried about getting stranded at the time. We're in the middle of the lake with a small swamp in front of us, and a rock face around 20 feet from our left, and the woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we had hit a sandbar, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, just inky black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and don't feel any current. We found though that we could move to the left and right, but just not forward, almost like we hit an invisible wall in a game. We both felt that the boat starts to sink down a little, almost like being sucked into the lake. Now, my friend started to row to the right and we make our way to the right, then once near the coast to the island. Far away from the island, seems to be nice and pristine, but once we get closer, it's desolate. The trees are dying or dead. The island's covered in stone and pine needles and dead lichen, with swamp and decay covering the lake. We managed to tie up the boat next to a dead pine tree, and we spend some time on the island checking it out and looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar and started to prod the water around off the island to find a good place to stay. Around this time, we both get this grave sense of unease. Personally, it felt like dread, kind of mixed with anxiety, like your body saying, "Get out of here now or you're gonna die." We then hear some commotion in the water, and we look around, and 10 feet away from us we see some geese running into the water. And we look around, and right where they've come from, we see what appears to be a black sculpture / scroll behind some rocks. Kind of like a mix, I guess. The closest thing I can describe is the thing in Star Wars when Jawas go behind the rocks. My friend also said he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We also had noticed too that the lake had gotten awfully still, and that the forest fell silent. We found a good place to port, and we decide we're going to row back. As we start heading back, I look to where we started and see a strange black figure staring at us standing where we left. At this point, I didn't want to point it out, so just start rowing. I row for another 10 minutes and take a short break. But whenever we take a break, we could hear the crushing of leaves and breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hug the coast as we head back. Even when we're staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I can't see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back and put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over, we find scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat as though something clawed it. As we start to leave, we decide to take one last look at the beaver dam. That's where we noticed there was a cave behind the dam. Upon seeing this, we decide to get the hell out and make our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkies to tell my granddad to come and pick us up. He's out with some hunting friends and we can't even get a signal at first, but eventually find him. Now as we left, I looked back and saw the figure standing on the island later that night too, as me and my friend were at a fire pit next to the cabin. We start hearing strange noises coming from the woods, almost sounding like a person trying to make a hoot sound of an owl. Although this could have just been my grandpa's hunting buddies in the cabin, but why would they do that? Now the land itself used to be Owaja, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any kind of story similar to mine. At first, I'm sorry for any mistakes. English isn't my first language. So as a child, I had a very traumatic experience. You can believe it or not, but this is what happened to me and why I'm still scared of the dark. When I was younger, I can't say exactly how old I was, about 4 I think. My big brother and I loved to camp outside our home. In front of the house there was a small forest. If you went outside, you stood directly in front of this really small forest. There was never anything spooky about it. We even played in it. Even when it was just a steep slope with trees, it was our favourite place to be, just playing, doing stupid things. Being a child, it was always my favourite place and a happy one. One day, we decided to camp outside again. We build the tent at night and we're inside it keeping warm. Everything looks normal. I'm not afraid at all. Also, brave enough to be like 15 meters to the entrance of a toilet in the middle of the night. I went in. A few minutes later I come back. I don't even look at the forest whatsoever. Do you know the feeling like somebody's watching you? Well, I have that. I had the feeling that I need to stop and look in the forest, so I stopped. I stopped to look at the forest, and there's 2 glowing red eyes staring back at me. I was frozen in fear, and I ran back to the tent into the safety, shivering in fear. Now I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a car because there's no roads nearby, and my brother said he saw them too, so I know it wasn't just me. It couldn't have been a predator because there was no light to make the eyes reflect and they were far too big. I've literally never seen anything like it, and I always get scared of forests today because of it. There is something my sister experienced about a week ago, which was similar to an experience a friend of hers had a month before. She was sleeping at her boyfriend's house, which backs onto a mountain with a forest starting in his backyard, when she decided to go get herself some food from upstairs. Her boyfriend refused to go with her as he had school in the morning and it's already 1. His room's in the basement, so she went up the stairs to the kitchen, on the same level as the rest of the family's bedrooms. Because she didn't want to wake up everyone else, she used her phone flashlight while she prepared herself bananas and hummus. While doing so, she heard what sounded like large footsteps. It actually sounded like a dog, but they don't have any pets. The door opens and closes about 3 or 4 times before finally closing. Then, the footsteps progress down the hall in her direction to a closet door where the same thing happened. Only this time, the door was left open. She's starting to get freaked out now. She tries to brush it off as a family member and went back to chopping her banana. Out of the corner of her eye though, she saw what appeared to be a very large black figure slowly leaning its way around the hallway corner, trying to look into the kitchen. She looked up, and it's gone. The same thing happened again. Only this time its neck is stretched out longer than before, looking at her. She looks up and finally catches a glimpse of something with white glowing eyes before disappearing around the corner. At this point, she's freaked out and grabs her knife. She quickly went around the corner to turn the light off, before gathering all of her stuff to head downstairs. When she told her boyfriend in the morning, he told her that the closed door, it's not just a closet door, it's an empty room with the attic door in the ceiling. They went in the room the next day to find that paint had been scratched off the attic door, and the floor was scratched beneath it. A friend of hers had a similar incident a month or so earlier when he was taking a leak in the backyard. He looked up only to see a tall creature with what he described to be glowing eyes and huge teeth standing amongst the trees. Once it notices him, it ran off, but then started coming after him once he started running towards the house. I work out in a very isolated stretch of the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and I've had an alarming amount of strange experiences while out here. The basic thing that happens are humans screaming far away in the woods. It's a really dense rainforest with no trails. Hearing high-pitched voices say 1 or 2 words like again or thank you. Sometimes I'm all alone, and sometimes my boyfriend hears them too. There is a really upsetting presence that sometimes appears to be a tall shadow that crouches and peeks out from behind things in a dumpster area, and all but a couple of co-workers have had unpleasant experiences while taking the recycling out. Another friend saw a face gliding by her window like it was on a skateboard looking in. Until recently, it's been mostly ghost happenings around here, but in the last week, we've had a few things that are different. I mean, like strange lights. The first thing that happened was my boyfriend and I are out in our bedroom, and we're flooded with an intense bright light. We just stare at each other for a while, confused as to what this is. The light then flickers on and off, and the room went black to pitch darkness. Our room backs off onto a dense forest, and we promptly look outside to make sure nobody's there, as this is a national forest, but there's no one. There's nothing but darkness and no movement. 2 nights ago, a co-worker of ours was returning home late at night when he got out of his car, and he can see an orange light hovering over one of the housing units. It does a couple of loops before popping out of sight. Now, the thing that worries me is that these are becoming more consistent. I spoke to a park ranger and he has no idea what they are either. I hope these stop. So a little while ago, I watched a news broadcast on my local news channel. It's about a woman that went missing 2 months ago. The circumstances of her disappearance were odd. She was staying in a family cabin in the woods, and she said she got in a shootout with 2 men, claiming she shot one in the face. She frantically called her friend and told her these things. The specific things she said is unknown. The police found bullet holes and other evidence that suggests there was a shootout, but they find no blood anywhere, despite her saying she shot one in the face. Her belongings are found, and it's all on the roof, and she's been missing ever since. There's no sense of this, it's like she literally just vanished. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now, the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods, and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and pass the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet, it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail, staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. She'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like, good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time, and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground, it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, this feels much longer than it should be, and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail or whatever it's called is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way, running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we were all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half, when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further, and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year, the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012, I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 19s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies and the long greasy hair, barely holding on the top of the head, starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that there's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions, and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door, and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30, and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe, one hell of a name, were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe, the real G, lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we're frontiersmen. We'd build lots of traps, shelters, and practice making fires with sticks. Basically the whole 9 yards. Now when we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the rail tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find a cool bridge to fish from, and camp out a little way off the track. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we're probably trespassing, but we're young and kids. Now we had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was very calm actually. Now after school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd occasionally see each other. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we're both in the same town for about a week. We'd do other stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer and a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day just to walk the trails, camp one night and walk home. The day we decided on We started out early in the morning. We actually had my wife drop us off in the old spot we used to start in, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We sat on the bridge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff before the night set in. We picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train track, and it made you feel as though you're in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. Now this is actually what we used to do in the old days. We'd walk the area and make sure that we're not just on some guy's house or something. We walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and end up on a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this hill, we'll be good. But when we get to the top of the hill, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, which is barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't appear to be anyone in it. It was quiet, with no movement that we can see, no lights even. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly as we near the building, and we see it's not a sugar shack, but it's an old church. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building with wooden planks that are busting out from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of that place, also weathered and black, looking creepy. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see the inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher to stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't wanna. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone, not even footprints. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot, and we decided to camp there. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel safe, but we're still a little uneasy. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods in the middle of nowhere. Besides, at this point it's dusk and we decide to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep. By this time night set in. Now as we lay in our hammocks, we're talking and we hear something in the direction of the church. What the hell's that? It sounds like people singing. Yeah, I know, man. And it did sound like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and they're singing, but it's not getting louder. We decide to creep back up the hill to see if we can spy on whatever that is. We could move very quietly in the woods. We're used to it from before and it's like second nature now. The moon was barely out and it provided just enough light so you couldn't really see us. We didn't touch our flashlights as we slowly got up the hill, not even whispering. We got to the top of the hill and we see a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. Singing? Well, it's from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and hushed conversations to each other. Can you hear this? I don't believe this. Craziest thing is that the light appears as though it's coming from a candle and flickering. And though we tried, we can't make out what's being sung. It sounded like church music but in another language. We sat there for a while, trying to see who was in there, but only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer. We have about a football field's length between us now. The singing has continued for a bit, but stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I'm already freaked out, but this voice scared the life out of me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher that you see in movies, but again, speaking in another language, we can't differentiate any words. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, then a bunch of voices would answer. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into the song, which is long and sustained and gets louder and louder. It got so loud it was actually disturbing enough that I covered my ears. It stopped now. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of here, when Joe puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, they're coming. We're far enough away that we can't make them out really, but we can literally see a line of figures walking out of the hallway, all in single file. Some of them have flashlights and began to sing again. They're moving towards us. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, erratically like they're shaking them. We sprint as quick as we can. We eventually stop seeing the lights and come to our road, but our map is really small and we're struggling to read it. We walk for about 15 more minutes and know where we are. We get to a gas station and my wife gets us. Now my wife and other friends say it's just kids messing around, but there was no way kids made them sounds. Not sure who these people were, but it definitely creeps me out. I remember that happening to me in Ohio. I'm doing seasonal work out in the Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I've heard things like a giggling coming from an empty room and a sliding door that closes on its own. Now one night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment unit cabins chatting when, all of a sudden, we hear screaming coming from directly in the woods. Initially, we thought it's a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like a sobbing, and in others it was frantic yelling. It literally goes on for 5 minutes straight, then stops. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stops, we heard what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio that starts muttering right next to where we're sitting. We can't make out what she's saying and it's only for a few seconds, but it's literally in the room next to us, and we can't see anything around. One of my friends opens the door to make sure there's nobody outside and we're completely alone. It should be added that everyone who lives in the buildings were all in the same room. Everything else was empty. Though the voice lasted for a few seconds, it stayed with me forever. When I was about 9, my family was in a big transitional phase. We moved out to a house deep in the woods in the country, and my mother to this day insists that it's haunted. My sleepwalking got really bad in those days, I mean incredibly. Sometimes I'd wake up on dirt, outside, with a blanket wrapped around me. I would look around in darkness for a light, and that would usually be my house porch light. It got so bad that my mum kind of barricaded me in at night with chairs sometimes. What scared me most, however, was not outside in the woods, near the national forest, no. It was my room. It was on the first floor, and with the layout of the house, it was on a silent, kind of slanted hill. It dug into the ground a bit. It was the closest thing to a basement possible, because it dug into the ground. There was only one window in my room, This window is in the top right corner of my room, and it was tiny. The window was right at ground level outside, so most of the time I would only see thick grass and dirt covering the glass. Sometimes when I woke up in the night though, I would see other things. Often, I saw boots standing there. They would stand there for hours at a time, facing inwards as though someone's staring at the wall, facing me. They were steel-toed, or looked like old leather boots. It looked as if they belonged to a man. It was so weird. The boot shifted weight sometimes back and forth, between one side and the other, as though the wearers lean in. The toe area was always scuffed too. I knew that they weren't my mother's or father's. It wasn't sleeping paralysis. I was always able to move in that. I would just sit and stare at these boots until I fell asleep. And for some reason, I always had the urge to never go and tell someone, and I don't know why. My family's already freaking out about the other experiences in the house, so I guess I didn't want to add to it. It stopped when my dad moved. Years later, and with the family camping, and all of us are telling scary stories, my father begins talking about how when he was young, he would have the sensation that something was slowly walking towards him. Has anyone ever seen it in a movie? Yeah, like that. He just explained like a pair of shoes that slowly walked towards him with malevolent intent. He goes on to explain how it stopped when he got older. I get this sour taste in my mouth. I ask my father if they're still toes. He shoots this weird look at me and nods. I say are they made of old, dusted leather and scuffed at the front. He looks scared now and nods. He said how do I know, and I explain my story, and he begins freaking out. It was so insane to make these realizations at the same time. And my father's room was right above mine, so someone with average height to that specific spot would have been right through to my dad's window. I've concluded that my father has spirits that follow him. I now know that they weren't there for me. I just hope they can stop. It was mid-December 2010. I was 16. I was off school for the half term and was playing video games all day basically. I lived in a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Due to my bedroom being upstairs and fairly small, my mum let me have the back room downstairs as my room too. This had all things in there like my PC, reptiles and guitars. We also had some doors leading into the garden near the forest. One night at around 2 AM, I was playing World of Warcraft and using Ventural talking to my guide friends. Pretty standard night. At the time, my sleeping pattern was awful and I was staying awake all night playing World of Warcraft. I pretty much always had my back door a little tiny bit open to let some cool air in, due to the heat coming off my computer and to cool it too. This had never been a problem. We lived in a relatively quiet area. Now our garden backs onto a small wooded area, and the only people I ever seen in there were kids making dens and playing etc. Nothing really to be scared of. While having headphones in, I can't really hear anything outside, because of the game volume I mean. I remembered playing and catching something out of the corner of my eye. Now my PC desk is about 3 feet away from the double doors against the wall. Anybody outside would be able to see me sitting at the desk. I turned and saw a hand opening the door. I froze and remembered spinning around in my chair ripping out my headphones. This would be a pretty good time to add that I was home alone. My mum and dad were at a wedding party and I was fine staying home on my own. Then a man, who's about 30 years old with a shaved head and scruffy beard, is standing at my door. Well, we kind of stare at each other for a few seconds and I ask him to close my door and get out of the garden. But he just casually walked in and stood there. I remembered freaking out a little and standing up and moving to the other side of the room. I moved towards a shelf where I had a penknife and took it out and tell him to go away. He then said that, and it chills me, he knew nobody was home and says let me stay on the couch until my parents' car shows up. I freaked the hell out. He got visibly agitated and starts walking around my room looking at my reptiles. I told him that I'm gonna call the police. I remember not being as terrified as I should have been. It was only for the reason what the situation is that I couldn't really understand what was going on. He then said something along the lines of, "You know, I'll stab you long before the police ever get here." I remember then going out of my room and shutting the door behind me, so he's locked in. I never heard him walk to the door or even try the handle. He then starts really pushing on it while screaming at me to move. I weigh up my options. It seemed like the best option would be to run out of the front door and knock on the neighbour's house, but my very small dog was asleep in the bedroom and I'm not gonna leave him. I know my dad kept a police cosh in the cupboard in his bedroom, so I sprinted to get it. While rustling in the drawers, I hear him going upstairs. He's now making his way through my parents' bedroom, staring at me through the banister. I'm terrified. He has a steak knife in his hands now, which I didn't see before, and he raises it up to me. I had the cosh and a penknife, but I wasn't confident. He didn't move for a bit until I asked him what he planned to do because this isn't going to end well for us. He told me he's going to go back and walk down the stairs. I heard him go through my room. I hear him slowly go through the other side. I crept back down the stairs, but what made it more intense is for some reason he turned off every single light. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs, I called the police watching the doors to see if he'd come. The police arrived 10 minutes later and my parents shortly after. They searched the woods behind my house and the fencing area, and they found some used needles, gloves, and a huge carpet roll, and about 10 cigarettes in the same place. They suggested he must have been watching me in the dark because it would have a perfect view of my room. And what's worst, they never found him. So this is something that I've kept to myself for over 2 years now, and every time I think about it, all the hairs on my body stand up. Here's something that my girlfriend and I really like to try and forget about. So my girlfriend and I really enjoyed trying to find new hikes in western Colorado. We decided to try a new trail that was not on the national monument, and was far away from any other trail. Was a good deal with the way out of town as well. Anyway, we're on one of the only car parks on the trailhead, and as soon as we're walking it gets really dark. Well, we make it all the way until the moon rose and I stop to hug my girlfriend. Now all of a sudden, further down the road, at least a few miles away, we hear automatic gunfire. It pops, then goes silent, then pops again. Now this kind of thing isn't normal in my area. Now my girlfriend said to me if she thought they were gunshots, and I say I don't think they are. Now we're in the middle of the wilderness at this point. We decided it'd be best to turn back about 2 miles down the trail. Now by this moment we're on top of a very large hill covered in desert shrubs. As soon as we stop talking, we realise something's wrong. All of the insects had stopped chirping, and the crickets had stopped entirely. All of the sounds of nature were gone. My girlfriend was facing further down the trail, and I was facing back the way we come from. She looked behind me and screams. She then starts running. I was already scared, but I figured the worst it could be is some drunk idiot. I turned and looked, and I immediately ran after her. I never ran so fast in my life. The shrubs are about 2 or 3 feet high in varying spots, and when I turned around, I don't know how to describe it, it looks more like a shadow. Even with the moonlight directly shining on it, it's almost absence of any light. Now it's already starting to stand up when I turn around. As soon as it fully rose up, I realised that I was looking up at this thing and it had to be at least a foot taller than me. It had very clear skin, and bones that don't appear to be human. We sprinted back to my car, still with the whole trail being silent. I was in such a hurry when we ran to the car that neither of us realised that I hadn't taken out my keys to open the car. We're halfway through the drive when we realised that. Now every single hair on my body was raised, and even if I'm being honest, I've never felt anything like it. Every fibre of my body told me to get out of there, and I was almost paralysed by fear that washed over me. Does anyone know what this could have been?